Right now, as you process the sound of my voice, your biological operating system is running, well, it's running dangerously close to a hard physical limit.
Yeah, it really is.
Because, you are actively burning through roughly 60 bits of your maximum 110 bit per second processing capacity just to decode these syllables and turn them into coherent English sentences.
Right, which, I mean, that leaves a terrifyingly small buffer, right?
Yeah.
Like about 50 bits for literally everything else, monitoring your environment, regulating your posture, or, even thinking about that JavaScript code you were writing this morning.
Exactly. So if a notification pings on your phone right now, your system just hits a bottleneck. You drop packets of information and, well, you experience a cognitive crash.
It's a total crash. And, we usually think of our minds as these, like, boundless, infinite landscapes. But the reality is that attention is just a rigid, zero-sum resource.
Yeah, and that constraint is, I think it's the perfect entry point for what we are exploring today, because we are looking at your brain not just as a squishy biological organ sitting in the dark, but like as the ultimate programmable operating system. You are the user, but more importantly, you are the developer.
I love that framing. Framing it as an operating system fundamentally changes how we approach learning. I mean, our mission for this deep dive today is to really reverse engineer that biological OS.
Right.
We are exploring how the brain structurally alters itself through repetition, right? How to isolate and master the habit loop, and, well, how to harness intense, unbroken focus to accelerate skill acquisition.
And to execute this deep dive, we are compiling a massive stack of sources today. Like, we are bridging behavioral psychology from James Clear's Atomic Habits with cognitive science research on deep work and flow.
We've got the university economics research syllabi, right?
Yeah. Analyzing the highly structured syllabi there, dissecting the bleeding-edge AI workflows of coding agents like Cursor, and looking at the rapidly approaching future of brain-computer interfaces with Neuralink.
It's a huge stack, but the overarching through line connecting all of this material is just profound. I mean, learning grows step by step, and the actual mechanisms happening inside your skull, they mirror software development with startling accuracy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we know from your notes that today was a learning day for you. You really dove into JavaScript, right?
Yeah, you started defining variables using the let it keyword, wrestling with simple logic.
Exactly, and you executed console outputs. In fact, we have the exact string of code you practiced today, which is console.log, quote, IDO overview space, quote. And I am intentionally honoring your exact spelling there with the slightly transposed audio typo and the trailing space.
Right, IDO overview. I mean, that specific string of keystrokes is just the perfect artifact to examine the foundational hardware of the brain, which is neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity, yeah.
Because when you sat down and typed that console.log command, you weren't just like rendering text on a screen. You were physically, biologically altering the architecture of your brain.
It's wild because self-help gurus throw the word neuroplasticity around like a magic spell,
Yeah.
But the biology is visceral. Practice literally builds stronger neural connections.
It does. It physically changes things.
So if we use that brain as code analogy, we can map programming concepts directly to your cognitive biology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a function in code is a specific brain task like remembering the syntax of a loop. The input is the act of learning, consuming new info. The loop is habit repetition. And the output is your physical behavior, your fingers striking the keyboard.
That's spot on. Let's look at the biological compilation of that code. So the first time you typed let, a very specific sequence of neurons had to fire together in your motor cortex and your prefrontal cortex.
Right.
And neuroscience operates on Hebb's postulate, neurons that fire together, wire together. The brain recognizes that this specific firing sequence is being demanded by the user, so it dispatches these specialized cells called oligodendrocytes.
Oligodendrocytes, okay.
Yeah, and these cells physically wrap that specific neural circuit in a fatty white substance called myelin.
Which is essentially neural insulation, right? I mean, think of a raw, uninsulated copper wire. The electrical signal just leaks out into the surrounding environment. It's slow, it suffers from interference, it degrades.
Exactly. But when you wrap that wire in a thick rubber jacket, the signal is contained. It travels exponentially faster.
Wow.
The mechanism is called saltatory conduction. The electrical impulse actually jumps over the myelinated sections, accelerating the processing speed of that specific pathway by up to 100 times.
100 times faster, just from repeating the action.
Yeah. Every single time you type that console.log command, you're adding another microscopic layer of myelin to that circuit. The behavior transforms from a slow, deliberate, clunky thought process into a lightning-fast, automated physiological reaction.
Okay, but I have to push back on the computer analogy here just a bit, because there is a glaring discrepancy in the user experience, right?
Oh, how so?
Well, if I open a terminal on my Mac and feed it a new Python script, the machine accepts the code instantly. It doesn't need to sleep for 8 hours to integrate the software. It doesn't get brain fog. So if we are just another operating system, why is learning to code so completely exhausting for a human?
What's fascinating here is that the discrepancy comes down to the hardware architecture.
Yeah.
Your brain is not a solid-state drive that just flips magnetic bits with zero friction.
Right, it's biology.
Exactly. It is living, metabolically expensive tissue. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy supply, specifically burning glucose and ATP.
ATP being adenosine triphosphate, right? The cellular energy currency.
Yes, exactly. So it's literally burning fuel to build new infrastructure in real time. The biological cost of learning is staggering. When you are wrestling with new JavaScript logic, you are forcing the prefrontal cortex, which is the conscious, effortful, analytical center of the brain, to fire continuously.
Which drains your battery.
You are rapidly depleting your local reserves of ATP, so that heavy brain fog feeling you get after an hour of intense coding. It isn't a metaphor. It is the literal biological friction of building new neural pathways before they are myelinated.
Man, that makes so much sense. Your system is basically screaming, this is too resource intensive to sustain, we need to automate this.
Right.
Which means the exhaustion is actually the biological trigger for automation. The brain wants to offload the heavy processing from the expensive prefrontal cortex to a much cheaper background process.
Precisely. And that transitions us into the mechanics of the habit loop. If the prefrontal cortex is the CPU struggling under the rendering load, the brain's solution is to write a highly efficient while loop and hand it over to a background daemon.
And that background daemon is the basal ganglia, right?
Yes, the basal ganglia. It is a cluster of neurons deep within the base of the brain, and its primary function is pattern recognition and behavioral automation. It takes repetitive sequences, packages them into discrete chunks, and runs them silently, requiring almost zero system resources.
So James Clear's framework in Atomic Habits models this process as a 4-step loop, right? Cue, craving, response, and reward. But to keep our terminology aligned with software development, we can observe it as cue, action, reward, and repeat.
I like that mapping. Cue, action, reward, repeat. The cue is the environmental trigger. It acts as the initialization command for the script.
Okay, so in the context of your learning day, the listener's day, the cue is sitting at your specific desk. The mechanical keyboard is there. The IDE, your integrated development environment, is open on the monitor. The visual input of that specific software interface hits your retina.
Exactly. And that visual data streams directly to the basal ganglia, signaling that the environmental context matches a previously stored routine. The system prepares to execute the associated action.
So the action is the behavior itself. You start typing. You write your console.log IDO overview. You engage in the struggle of the syntax, making variables with let. And then comes the critical component, the reward.
The reward, right.
The code successfully compiles. The text appears in the debug console. You experience this little micro hit of satisfaction.
But we need to be very precise about what that satisfaction actually is biologically. That feeling is a spike of dopamine. Popular culture treats dopamine as just a pleasure chemical, but in neurobiology, it is actually a learning transmitter.
Really? Not just pleasure?
No, it's a routing protocol. When dopamine floods the synapses after a successful action, it chemically stamps that neural pathway. It tells the brain whatever biological sequence just occurred to produce this result, tag it, save it, and increase the probability of executing it again when we see this cue.
Wow. So if we want to program ourselves, if you, the listener, want to ensure that sitting at the desk always compiles the coding habit rather than triggering, say, the infinite scroll of a social media feed, you have to manipulate those 4 variables.
Absolutely. The sources outline the 4 laws of behavior change for this exact purpose. The first law targets the cue, make it obvious. You are essentially designing your physical environment to force the initialization command.
Because environment is the invisible architecture of human behavior, right? If you want code every morning, the IDE must be the first thing you see. Leave your JavaScript notebook open on your keyboard the night before. You are front-loading the visual cues so the basal ganglia cannot ignore the trigger.
Exactly. And then the second law addresses the craving, or the reward anticipation, which is make it attractive. You have to actively engineer the anticipation of that dopamine spike.
Like temptation bundling, right?
Yes. Temptation bundling is linking an existing, deeply ingrained craving with the new target action. Like, you only allow yourself to drink your highly engineered, perfectly brewed pour-over coffee while you have a code editor open. You are hacking the associative network of the brain.
Okay, so the third law targets the action. Make it easy. And I guess this relies on the biological principle of energy conservation we discussed earlier, right? The human organism will inevitably default to the path of least metabolic resistance.
That's right.
But wait, here's where I want to challenge this framework. We just established that building myelin requires intense cognitive friction. The brain has to struggle with the syntax to trigger the structural change. So if we make it easy, aren't we just removing the desirable difficulty required for neuroplasticity?
Ah, that's a great point. But the distinction lies between the friction of initiating the task versus the cognitive friction during the task.
Oh, I see.
The physical and logistical friction to start coding must be near zero. If opening your coding environment requires you to find a buried folder, launch a VPN, and wait through 3 loading screens, the basal ganglia will just abort the script and open a web browser instead.
Right, it's just too much work to even begin.
Exactly. This is where the 2-minute rule applies to the initiation. You scale the habit down so starting takes less than 2 minutes. You tell yourself, I'm only going to open the IDE and write one single let variable.
So you minimize the logistical friction so you can maximize the cognitive friction of the actual deep learning.
Precisely. Because once you cross the initiation threshold, the momentum of the task often overrides the initial resistance. Which brings us to the 4th law, targeting the reward. Make it satisfying. What is immediately rewarded is neurologically repeated.
But this introduces a massive bug in the human operating system when it comes to complex skill acquisition, doesn't it? Because the rewards of learning JavaScript are heavily, painfully delayed. You don't get hired as a senior developer or launch a wildly profitable app after 1 day of typing console.log.
No, you definitely don't.
The dopamine loop just starves. And the sources conceptualize this problem as the plateau of latent potential.
The plateau is such a profound visual model of behavioral economics. If you plot time on the x-axis and results on the axis, human expectation projects a straight, linear, 45-degree line upward. Put in 1 unit of effort, get 1 unit of visible skill.
Right, that's what we expect.
But biology doesn't compound linearly.
Yeah.
The actual curve of results stays brutally flat for an extended period before finally curving upward exponentially.
And that massive gap between the linear expectation and the flat reality, that is the valley of disappointment.
Valley of disappointment, yes. It's brutal.
Right. You are sitting at the desk every day, burning ATP, fighting the syntax errors, but the output still looks like amateur code. It feels completely futile.
But what you have to remember is that the metabolic effort is not vanishing into a void. It is being stored structurally. Those oligodendrocytes we talked about, they are wrapping the myelin. The neural networks are optimizing.
You're doing the underground work.
Exactly. You are building the subterranean infrastructure required to support a massive leap in capability. When you finally cross the threshold and the curve shoots upward, the external world will label it an overnight success. But it is entirely the product of automated loops running silently through the valley of disappointment.
Okay, but to keep those loops running, to actually write the code during that flatlining period, you have to protect your prefrontal cortex from crashing, because you cannot compile complex logic if your mental RAM is overflowing. We have to talk about attention management or, how to debug the amygdala.
We absolutely do,
Yeah.
because we established that biological hard limit of 110 bits of information per second, right? Attention is the currency of cognitive performance, and it is ruthlessly finite.
Which absolutely destroys the modern myth of multitasking. Like, if you are trying to write JavaScript while simultaneously listening to a deep dive and keeping one eye on a Slack channel, you aren't actually running those processes in parallel. You are forcing the prefrontal cortex to rapidly switch contexts.
And that context switching carries a devastating physiological tax. The research refers to it as attention residue. When you pull your focus away from your code to read a text message, your neural circuitry doesn't instantly snap to the new input. A significant portion of your cognitive bandwidth remains stuck processing the previous task.
Let's use the typo in the listener's notes as the perfect example. You wrote console.log IDO overview. If your phone vibrates halfway through typing the word audio and you glance at a notification, you trigger the switching tax.
Right?
When you look back at the screen, your processing power is fractured. The research indicates it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to fully recover your deep focus after a single interruption. So you won't even notice the typer for another 20 minutes because the visual processing center just doesn't have the bandwidth to catch the transposed letters.
That's a great example. Operating in a state of continuous partial attention means you are perpetually living in the cognitive residue of the last distraction. You never access the full 110 bits. And to understand the root cause of this vulnerability, we have to examine the architectural conflict inside the brain. It is a literal biological turf war between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
The CPU versus the aggressive interrupt request. The prefrontal cortex is your logical, long-term planning center. It is the part of your identity that says, I am going to endure the valley of disappointment and master JavaScript because it aligns with my long-term career architecture.
The amygdala, however, is a much older, more primitive cluster of nuclei. It functions as the brain's rapid response alarm system, constantly scanning the environment for immediate physical threats or immediate high-calorie, high-dopamine rewards.
Okay.
When the coding gets frustrating, when you hit a wall of syntax errors, the amygdala perceives that cognitive distress as an immediate threat to your energy reserves.
So it flashes a massive red push notification across your mental screen. Energy depletion detected. Abort task. Seek immediate dopamine. And if that impulse is strong enough, it triggers an amygdala hijack.
The hijack is a literal physiological override. The amygdala severs the functional connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. Your CPU is forcibly throttled down.
Wow.
Your rational long-term goals just evaporate, and you are driven entirely by an automated, emotional script seeking instant gratification. You find yourself scrolling through a feed without any conscious memory of making the decision to pick up the phone.
So what does this all mean? Like, the million-dollar question for anyone trying to learn a hard skill is, how do we write an exception handler for this? We can't uninstall the amygdala. It's hard-coded into the biological firmware.
No, we need it.
Right, if a car swerves into your lane on the highway, you need the amygdala to hijack the system and jerk the steering wheel before the prefrontal cortex even processes the physics of the impending crash. But how do we stop it from hijacking our coding sessions?
The source material offers highly specific cognitive behavioral interventions to restore the connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. The first is a metacognitive practice called urge surfing.
Urge surfing. So when the amygdala fires and you feel the overwhelming physical compulsion to abandon the ID and check your phone, I think the default response is to fight the urge with sheer willpower, right? You try to force the CPU to overpower the alarm.
But willpower is tied to glucose levels in the prefrontal cortex. It depletes rapidly. Urge surfing removes the friction. You treat the impulse as a physical ways. You don't fight it, but you don't act on it either.
Oh, interesting.
You turn your attention to the physiological sensation of the craving, like the tightness in your chest, the restless energy in your hands.
Yeah.
You observe the wave crest and naturally recede. By maintaining the role of the observer, you keep the prefrontal cortex engaged.
And for more acute hijack scenarios, the sources detail the STEC-OP skill. It's an acronym that functions as a manual reboot sequence for the nervous system. S stands for stop. You literally freeze your physical motor functions. Do not touch the mouse.
Right.
T stands for take a breath. And this is not just mindfulness rhetoric, this is a mechanical hack of your autonomic nervous system.
The biological mechanism here is profound. When you take a slow, deep, diaphragmatic breath, you physically stimulate the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve releases acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that rapidly lowers your heart rate.
Ah, okay.
This sends a definitive biological signal to the brainstem and the amygdala that the organism is not under physical attack. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, effectively canceling the red alert and bringing the prefrontal cortex back online.
Wow, so then O stands for observe. You look at your internal state and the external environment objectively. Like, I am frustrated because I missed a semicolon, not because I am in physical danger.
Exactly.
And P is proceed mindfully. Now that the CPU is re-engaged, you make a conscious executive decision about the next line of code.
But relying entirely on manual reboots is a dangerous game, however. This brings us to the concept of ego depletion. If you spend your entire learning session deploying the STIOP skill and fighting off the urge to open new tabs, your prefrontal cortex will eventually exhaust its metabolic reserves.
And by the afternoon, the amygdala will win by default.
It will. The ultimate defense is pre-programming your responses using implementation intentions, if-then algorithms written directly into your daily routine.
Like, if my phone vibrates while I have the IDE open, Then I will immediately take a vagal nerve breath and read the last line of code I wrote aloud.
Yes, you are delegating the executive control to the environment. You remove the burden of decision-making in the moment of stress. The script just executes automatically, preserving your finite cognitive energy for the actual work.
And preserving that energy is the absolute prerequisite for entering the deepest, most productive state of the human operating system. We are talking about deep work and the psychological state of flow, because this is where the code actually compiles.
Cal Newport defines deep work as professional, distraction-free concentration that pushes your cognitive capabilities to their absolute limits. It is the antithesis of shallow work, the low-bandwidth tasks like answering emails or moving cells in a spreadsheet, which just do not trigger the heavy myelination process.
Right. And when you structure deep work perfectly, you cross the psychological threshold into flow. Coined by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, flow is the sensation of effortless, frictionless attention. It is the state where the code seems to write itself.
But flow is incredibly fragile.
Right, because it operates on a strict algorithm known as the Goldilocks rule. Challenge must perfectly approximate skill.
The balance must be exact. If you are a beginner who just learned what a let variable is, and you attempt to architect a full-stack encrypted database application from scratch, the challenge vastly outweighs your skill.
Yeah, that's just panic mode.
Exactly. The amygdala perceives the massive cognitive deficit as a threat, triggering intense anxiety and avoidance. Conversely, if you are a senior software engineer and you spend an hour just typing console.log statements, your skill vastly outweighs the challenge. The lack of cognitive stimulation triggers apathy and boredom.
So flow exists on the razor's edge between anxiety and boredom. You must be engaged in a task that stretches your current neural architecture just slightly beyond its comfort zone.
And when you hit that equilibrium, the physiological effects are extraordinary. You experience a total loss of self-consciousness. Your perception of time radically distorts. Hours feel like minutes.
And the mechanics of time distortion trace directly back to that 110-bit processing limit we talked about at the start. When you are in flow, the challenge of the JavaScript logic is so perfectly calibrated that it consumes all 110 bits of your available bandwidth.
Yes, there is zero cognitive RAM left over.
None. The background processes that normally monitor the physical sensation of hunger, the background anxiety about a social interaction, and even the internal metronome that tracks the passage of time, they are entirely suspended due to lack of system resources. Your entire reality collapses into the syntax on the screen.
Achieving this state, though, requires relentless structural engineering of your environment and your tasks. The sources provided an incredibly illuminating parallel for this, actually. The rigorous structuring of a university economics research paper.
Oh yeah, specifically the syllabus for an Econ 190 head per seminar. At first glance, a university syllabus feels disconnected from coding habits, but it is actually a masterclass in engineering flow.
It really is.
Because a massive research project like writing a 50-page original thesis is a cognitive nightmare. It is highly ambiguous and overwhelming. If a professor simply told a student, write a thesis, see you in 15 weeks, the student's amygdala would immediately flag the ambiguity as a massive threat. The result is total paralysis and procrastination until the night before the deadline.
The syllabus acts as an algorithmic step-down transformer for that cognitive anxiety. It aggressively constrains the scope of the challenge to match the student's current skill level. Week 3 demands an annotated bibliography. Week 4 requires a crisp, one-paragraph statement of the research question. Week 8 introduces data manipulation.
By fracturing the massive, ambiguous goal into highly specific, manageable weekly deliverables, the professor is artificially constructing the Goldilocks rule. Clear goals, constrained parameters, and immediate feedback from the advisor. The cognitive load is perfectly managed week by week, preventing the system from crashing.
What is truly fascinating is that this exact same structural scaffolding is required not just for the biological brain, but for the most advanced artificial intelligence available today.
The AI agents.
Yes. The source materials included extensive documentation on AI coding workflows, specifically utilizing an IDE called Cursor in advanced autonomous AI agents.
Because the general public assumes that a massive large language model can just ingest an entire code base, understand the end goal, and flawlessly write the software in one shot. But that is a profound misunderstanding of how the technology works, right?
Completely. Advanced AI agents suffer from their own version of cognitive overload and attention residue. If you give an AI an ambiguous, massive task without constraints, it hallucinates. It writes garbage code, it loses track of the file structure, and it corrupts the project.
To prevent this, developers force the AI to operate within a rigid, highly structured loop. The AI relies on a specific file, often called workflowstate.md. Before the AI is allowed to execute a single line of code, it must read the rules, check the current state of the project configuration, explicitly state its plan, and update the state file. It must follow a blueprint phase before it acts.
The parallels are undeniable. The AI's context window, the amount of information it can, hold in its head at one time, is the digital equivalent of human working memory. Just as the LLM's context window degrades if it isn't constantly grounded by the workflow state file, the human prefrontal cortex degrades and gets lost in distractions without rigid environmental structures.
The AI needs a markdown file to prevent hallucination. The human mind needs time blocking, a clean desk, and specific implementation intentions to prevent the amygdala hijack. The fundamental truth across both silicon and biology is that complex processing requires an aggressively protected environment.
It's all about protection and structure.
Okay, so the scaffolding protects the processing environment and allows you to enter flow today. But what guarantees that you will come back and open the IDE tomorrow? The valley of disappointment is vast, and the final output of your coding journey might be months away. How do we sustain the energy required to continually wrap that mile in?
That requires an understanding of small wins and the progress loop. The research on motivation centers heavily on a concept called inner work life. This is the continuous, often subconscious flow of emotions, intrinsic motivations, and perceptions you experience as you navigate your tasks.
And the data is unequivocal, right? The single most powerful catalyst for boosting your inner work life is making tangible headway in meaningful work.
The progress loop relies entirely on the neurobiology of the small win. A small win is just a minor incremental milestone. It is finally understanding why your let variable was throwing an error. It is spotting the spelling mistake in console.log IDO overview and fixing it so the terminal prints correctly.
When you achieve that minor milestone, the brain releases a microdose of dopamine. That dopamine generates a transient feeling of pride and satisfaction. This positive emotional spike feeds directly back into your inner work life, elevating your baseline motivation.
Exactly.
High motivation drives higher performance during the next coding session, which naturally yields another small win. The system becomes a self-sustaining, recursive loop.
Let's use software development as the ultimate analogy for this. In professional coding, developers rely on automated tests. You write a script whose only job is to test if your main program is functioning. Every time you tweak the code, you run the test. If it passes, a little green check mark appears on the screen.
Ah, the green check mark.
Yes, that green check mark is a synthetically engineered small win. It provides an immediate dopamine hit, confirming you are on the right track, and it gives you the neurological momentum to write the next function.
Furthermore, these small wins compound on an identity level. James Clear's work emphasizes that every time you sit down and successfully execute that console.log command, you are not merely completing a task, you are casting a physiological vote for the type of person you want to become. You are layering evidence into your neural network that you are, in fact, a programmer.
You're changing who you are biologically.
But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. I want to throw a wrench into this loop because there is a massive caveat in the research. What happens if the work is highly meaningful to the corporate entity you work for, but it means absolutely nothing to you as an individual?
Oh, this is a crucial point.
If you are stuck in a soul-crushing job, writing code for a product you despise, do those little green check marks still trigger the dopamine? Does the progress loop still compile if the overarching goal is hollow?
The biological response is definitive. No, it does not. The dopamine reward system is intimately tied to the prefrontal cortex's assessment of value. If your executive functioning determines that the ultimate goal is pointless, or if you are in an environment where your contributions are consistently dismissed by management, the brain initiates dopamine receptor downregulation.
Whoa. The system recognizes the effort is disconnected from biological or psychological value, so it literally stops releasing the reward chemical.
Exactly the problem. You can accumulate thousands of green check marks, but if the end goal holds no intrinsic value, the small wins are stripped of their psychological power. The work must resonate with your personal architecture of meaning for the loop to function.
So if you are learning JavaScript purely because a blog post told you it was a lucrative career path, but you harbor zero genuine curiosity for logic and system design, those small wins will not generate enough dopamine to sustain you through the valley of disappointment.
No, they won't. The biological reward system must be perfectly aligned with your conscious values.
When that alignment occurs, the friction of learning plummets. But we have spent this entire deep dive analyzing the biological friction, right? The metabolic cost of wrapping myelin, the exhaustion of the CPU, the constant vigilance required to suppress the amygdala.
Yes.
So, what happens when we completely bypass the biological I/O ports? What happens when the biological operating system interfaces directly with the digital architecture?
Now we are entering the territory of brain-computer interfaces, specifically the developments happening at Neuralink. This transitions our discussion from optimizing neuroplasticity to contemplating a fundamental leap in human evolution.
Because, according to the sources, Elon Musk recently announced a roadmap targeting high-volume production of Neuralink BCI implants by 2026. This is no longer speculative science fiction. We are moving rapidly from highly specialized clinical trials toward a widely deployable technological platform.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, to grasp the magnitude of this leap, recall our brain as code analogy. The output of your biological system relies on an incredibly slow physical chain of events. Your prefrontal cortex decides to write a line of JavaScript. It sends an electrical signal to the motor cortex.
Right.
The motor cortex fires an action potential down the central nervous system through the spinal cord and into the peripheral nerves of your arm. The muscle fibers in your fingers contract, and you strike the mechanical keys.
A huge, slow process. But a brain-computer interface intercepts the signal at the source. The Neuralink implant, sitting directly on the cortex, monitors the electrical spikes, the firing of individual neurons in the motor cortex.
Exactly.
It decodes those biological action potentials and translates them into digital inputs in milliseconds. It completely bypasses the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves, and the physical keyboard. The biological intention becomes immediate digital execution.
The data from the initial clinical trials illustrates the profound bandwidth upgrade this represents. I mean, look at Nolan Arbaugh, the first human recipient of the implant. He is paralyzed from the shoulders down. By utilizing the BCI, he was able to play Mario Kart against his father.
Mario Kart?
Yeah, he's not using a specialized mouth controller or eye tracking software. He's simply thinking about moving his hands, and the implant is reading the motor cortex spikes and translating them into directional inputs on the screen.
The speed and fidelity are just breathtaking. The sources indicate that Nolan rapidly set and subsequently shattered the world record for brain-to-computer cursor control speed. He is operating a digital interface at a velocity that approaches a fully able-bodied user.
And then consider the second patient, Alex, who also suffers from severe motor impairment. Utilizing the Neuralink interface, Alex opened CAD software complex computer-aided design programs and successfully designed a custom 3D printed charger holder.
CAD software is hard enough to use with mouse and keyboard.
Exactly. And he is manipulating intricate three-dimensional geometry in a digital environment purely through cognitive intention.
If we extrapolate this technology out, it forces a radical reevaluation of everything we've discussed regarding the cognitive friction of learning. I mean, the human brain evolved to learn slowly, interacting with the physical environment through narrow, low bandwidth I/O ports, our eyes, our ears, our fingers. It takes months of intense ATP burning effort to build the myelin required to type code at 100 words per minute.
But a BCI removes the physical bottleneck entirely. The communication bandwidth between the human operating system and the machine becomes exponentially wider.
Which introduces some dizzying philosophical and cognitive implications. We established that the brain fundamentally operates like code. So what happens when the interface becomes seamless and bidirectional? Currently, we're only extracting data from the motor cortex to move a cursor. But if the implant can write data into the cortex with the same fidelity, can we bypass the valley of disappointment entirely?
That's the huge question.
Could you theoretically download the syntax and logic of JavaScript directly into the neural pathways, perfectly wrapping the myelin via artificial electrical stimulation?
It invokes the classic sci-fi trope of downloading kung fu directly into your consciousness.
All right.
While the current technology is strictly read-only for motor functions, the theoretical foundation for read-write cognitive interfaces is actively being laid. If we achieve that, we circumvent the biological friction of neuroplasticity.
But wait, our entire discussion on flow and deep learning hinged on the necessity of that friction. We talked about how the struggle, the desirable difficulty of pushing your cognitive limits to the breaking point is what actually builds profound, durable understanding.
Exactly.
If you eliminate the struggle and just artificially imprint the syntax, do you actually understand the logic? Do you experience the identity-shifting power of the progress loop if a machine achieved the small win for you?
That is the central tension of the cognitive future. The psychology of peak human performance relies entirely on the challenge-skill balance of the Goldilocks rule. If a neural implant removes the challenge of skill acquisition, do we lose the capacity to experience flow? Or does the baseline of human capability simply shift upward, allowing our biological CPU to tackle vastly more complex, currently unimaginable abstract challenges?
Man, we are staring down a frontier where the biological OS and the digital OS completely merge, and it redefines the concept of attention management. When the algorithm is physically integrated into your neural pathways, ignoring a digital distraction is no longer a matter of putting your phone in another room or taking a deep breath to calm the vagus nerve.
No, it will require a level of cognitive discipline and structural architecture that we haven't even begun to conceptualize. The stakes for mastering your internal operating system have never been higher.
Let's zoom out and synthesize this incredible journey for you, our listener. We started by examining the raw biological hardware. We learned that the act of learning physically alters the architecture of your brain through neuroplasticity. Every time you struggle through a new line of code, every time you type console.log AURED overview, you are dispatching cells to wrap neural circuits in myelin, transforming slow, conscious effort into lightning-fast capability.
We observed how those repeated sequences are offloaded from the energy-hungry prefrontal cortex to the highly efficient basal ganglia, automating your behavior through the precise manipulation of cues, actions, and dopamine-driven rewards.
We analyzed the intense vulnerability of human attention, recognizing the biological hard limit of 110 bits per second. We explored the necessity of defending the logical prefrontal cortex from the emotional hijack of the amygdala by deploying structured breathing, observing urges without acting, and pre-programming our responses with implementation intentions.
We dissected the architecture of deep work and flow, discovering that intense, unbroken focus demands highly structured environments. Whether you are a university student managing an economics thesis, an advanced AI agent constrained by a workflow state file, or a human brain balancing challenge and skill to achieve maximum cognitive output.
And we established that sustaining this profound effort over the long haul requires a mastery of the progress loop. You must relentlessly hunt for small wins and work that holds deep intrinsic meaning, leveraging that dopamine feedback to cast votes for the identity you are building. Ultimately, by reverse engineering these biological and psychological systems, you can program your own mind for success with the same precision you use to master the logic of JavaScript.
But as we look toward the horizon of brain-computer interfaces, an unavoidable question emerges, one that I want you to carry with you. We have spent this deep dive framing the brain as an operating system that you can actively program through rigorous habits and environmental discipline. But as neural implants blur the boundary between biological thought and digital execution, will this technology finally liberate us from our biological limits, allowing us to exist in an ultimate, unbroken state of flow? Or, if a machine learning algorithm intimately wired into your cortex can perfectly predict, optimize, and execute your habit loops for you, do you remain the programmer of your mind, or do you silently, imperceptibly become the software itself?
The ultimate OS upgrade, or the ultimate loss of administrative privileges. It is a brilliant and unsettling concept to mull over. As you return to your IDE today, as you practice your next line of logic, define your next let variable or build your next while loop, keep your awareness locked on what is happening beneath the surface. You aren't just pushing pixels on a monitor, you are physically, chemically, and structurally rewriting the hardware of your own mind. Every keystroke is another layer of myelin, every small win is a structural reinforcement in the vast architecture of your cognition. Keep coding, keep building, and protect the system.
Today was not about a big result.
No, not at all.
Today was about beginning.
Yeah.
Welcome to this deep dive, where we're exploring something that, well, it seems simple, but it's actually incredibly complex. We're calling this focus Day 1, Something is Starting.
Right. And we really want you, the listener, to keep that in mind as we go through this.
Exactly, because, we spend so much time obsessed with the finish line. We all want that viral moment, right? The big explosion, the overnight success that gets blasted all over social media. But today, we are completely ignoring the finish line. We're zooming all the way in on the quiet, almost invisible mechanics of growth. Because at first, when you sit down to start something new, a business, a fitness journey, learning a language, it feels like absolutely nothing is happening.
Yeah, it really does.
There's no magic, no explosion.
Yeah.
When you create every day, your brain slowly connects ideas. Your thought becomes clearer. A visual style starts to form. Growth is not always loud. Sometimes it's just quiet.
Yeah.
invisible.
Like evolution or like building a habit. You don't see the change immediately. You don't look in the mirror after one workout and see a totally different person staring back.
Right.
But if you keep going day after day, those microscopic shifts compound into something huge. And that's our mission today. We're going to unpack exactly how those small steps actually interact, and we've got a massive stack of sources to go through.
We really do.
We're going from 19th century philosophy straight through the neuroscience of deep work into surprisingly construction engineering and ending up at the absolute bleeding edge of brain-machine interfaces.
Okay, let's unpack this because to really grasp what's happening on day one, we have to start with a central motif from the research. It's this concept of the eye of evolution, the eye of thought, and this idea of infinite perspective.
Yeah, think of it like a simple image on a clean white background. Very stark, but with a deep meaning.
Right, because to understand how day one works, we first have to figure out how your mind can even focus on a goal that doesn't physically exist yet. Like, how do you sit at a blank screen and direct your eye toward an imaginary future?
And that brings us directly into the philosophy of mind. Specifically, this concept called intentionality. If we rewind to the late 19th century, there was this German philosopher, Franz Brentano. Right. And he wrote this foundational work where he called intentionality the mark of the mental. Basically saying this is the one characteristic that separates mental phenomena from physical things.
So simply put,
intentionality is your mind's ability to direct its focus towards something. Every mental act has a target. When you perceive something. When you desire something.
But, and this is why I got a bit tripped up in the reading, he called this the intentional inexistence of an object, which sounds like a total contradiction. How can something exist and not exist at the same time?
Yeah, inexistence is a tricky translation from the original German. It doesn't mean non-existence, like a ghost, it's locative. It means the object exists in the mind.
Oh, got it.
It has its existence within your psychological state, rather than, say, sitting on a table in the physical world. But this created what philosophers call the problem of intentional inexistence, because it forces us to ask, what is the actual reality of the things we think about if they aren't physically real?
Okay, let me give a concrete example for you listening, because there's this classic philosophical puzzle in the sources. It's about Mary thinking about Superman.
Ah, yes. The Superman problem.
Right. So Mary is sitting there, intensely thinking about Superman. Cape, flying, Krypton. But Superman isn't real. So she's thinking about nothing, or a non-existent thing. And bringing it back to day one, if you're building a new app, that finished app is your Superman. It doesn't exist yet. How do philosophers resolve that?
What's fascinating here is how fiercely different camps debate this exact puzzle. You've got three main approaches. First is eliminativism.
The hardliners.
Exactly. They take a very strict scientific stance. They argue that if a thought's meaning depends on pointing to a real thing, then pointing to a fake thing means the thought has no actual meaning. They'd say Mary isn't really thinking in a meaningful way.
Which is just, playing devil's advocate, that feels incredibly dismissive. It denies Mary's whole subjective experience. When I'm imagining my future project, I am burning serious mental calories. You can't tell me I'm doing nothing.
And that pushback is exactly why the second camp, relationalism, popped up. They try to find a proxy object. They say maybe Mary is thinking about an abstract, platonic form of Superman, or maybe she's thinking about a concrete web of neurons firing in her own brain.
But that doesn't feel right either. When you think of Superman, you don't feel like you're thinking about your own neurons.
No, you think about the guy in spandex. Which brings us to the third option.
Adverbialism. I actually love this one.
It's very elegant. Adverbialists argue that intentionality isn't a bridge between a thinker and an object at all. It's just a property of the thinker. Mary isn't thinking about Superman. Mary is just thinking Supermanly.
Thinking Supermanly. I love that phrasing so much. It shifts the whole focus onto the action of the mind itself. And if we take that into the modern era, you get thinkers like Daniel Dennett talking about the intentional stance.
Right. Dennett basically says, look, whether the object is real or not, treating a system as if it has a goal is just a highly effective predictive strategy.
So connecting this back to day one for the listener, intentionality is the absolute prerequisite. Your mind has to form a crisp representation of a future state, a new you, and hold that Supermanly thought firmly enough to direct your cognitive resources.
Yes. But the real question is, how do we anchor that intentionality so our mind doesn't just wander off after 5 minutes?
Which is the harsh reality of sitting down to work. And there's an amazing analogy for this in the academic writing sources we pulled. Think about how we're taught to write an essay. Every paragraph needs a topic sentence.
It's a brilliant analogy for human behavior. Without a topic sentence, a paragraph collapses into a rambling mess. And without a controlling idea, your day one falls apart.
Exactly. The key is finding the sweet spot. If your goal is, I'm going to work on my business, that's way too broad. It gives the mind no specific target. It's like writing a paper with the thesis, studying overseas is hard. Okay, great. Where do we go from there?
Right, but if you go too specific, like, I'm going to optimize the hexadecimal color codes on the checkout button while cross-referencing 3 tax codes, your brain gets paralyzed. You need an anchor. Something like, I am going to map out the customer journey from landing page to checkout.
There's that Economics Pro Seminar guide from George Washington University in our stack. They make this so visceral, they warn students that a research paper must be relentlessly narrow.
They actually force students to submit 3 completely different proposed topics in the second week, right?
Yeah. Just to break the pressure of finding the perfect idea, the ultimate test is, can you boil your entire worldview on a subject down to 2 sentences? If not, you don't have an argument, you just have a cloud of anxiety.
And what happens without that controlling idea? The guide says students will just wander the internet for snippets to cut and paste at the last moment.
Which is the exact trap of day one. You just wander. But here's where it gets really interesting. We can scale this philosophical concept up to the level of raw biology. There's this profound concept in computational neuroscience called active inference.
Carl Friston's work. This is arguably one of the most important frameworks for understanding behavior today. Active inference starts with the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy. Everything naturally moves toward chaos.
To stay alive, any adaptive agent, a cell, a human, a robot, has to resist dissolving into its environment.
Exactly, and Friston argues that an organism does this by constantly minimizing surprise. And surprise here isn't a birthday party, it's the mathematical discrepancy between the state the agent expects to be in and the state it's actually in. Our brains are prediction machines.
Wait, let me make sure I'm getting this. It sounds like my brain is basically an advanced thermostat. If my internal model expects the room to be 70 degrees, but my skin registers 50 degrees, that gap is the surprise.
That is exactly right. But a thermostat has a thermometer to measure reality. A brain locked inside a dark skull does not. We can't access the objective world directly, so we use a proxy borrowed from physics called variational free energy.
Okay, getting into the deep end. What is free energy here?
Think of it as an upper limit on that surprise. By minimizing free energy, we indirectly minimize surprise. And we have 2 ways to do this when we detect that 50-degree room. Option 1, update our internal model. I guess 50 degrees is the new normal.
That's perception.
Right. Option 2 is action. We physically change the world to match our model. We get up and close the window.
So bringing this all the way back to you, the listener, on day one, you set a controlling idea. You decide, I am a person who writes 1,000 words a day. By planting that flag, you intentionally create a massive state of surprise or free energy between your current reality and your predicted reality.
Precisely. So the quiet, grueling work of day one is simply your brain engaging in active inference. You're acting on the world, typing words to reduce that free energy. It feels quiet, but underneath, it is a ferocious biological process.
And that transition from raw biology to messy daily behavior leads us perfectly into the architecture of day one. Because if active inference explains why we act, we need a systems approach for how to act without burning out.
We have to talk about James Clear and Atomic Habits, because he explains the frustration of the beginning better than anyone. He introduces the plateau of latent potential.
The graph. Imagine a graph with time on the bottom and results going up. We all expect a straight upward line. I put in 1 unit of effort, I get 1 unit of progress.
But compounding growth is a curved line. It stays flat for a long time before arcing up. And that gap between our straight line expectation and the flat reality Clear calls that the valley of disappointment.
The valley of disappointment, where dreams go to die.
Yeah.
So if you're listening and you've been working for 3 weeks with no results, you aren't failing. You're just in the valley. You're storing potential energy.
It's the ice cube analogy. Heat an ice cube from 25 degrees to 31, nothing happens. Hit 32, it melts. The work wasn't wasted, it was just accumulating. Getting 1% better every day makes you 37 times better by the end of the year.
But knowing the math doesn't drag you through the valley. Clear says we have to invert how we set goals. He uses an onion metaphor. Outer layer is outcomes, what you get. Middle is processes, what you do. But the core is identity, what you believe.
Most start from the outside. I want to lose weight, but true change is inside out. You have to decide who you want to be. The goal isn't to write a book, it's to become a writer.
Every action is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. That quote is constantly in my head. You write one paragraph, you cast a vote for the writer identity. You don't need a unanimous victory, just a majority.
And this focus on identity bridges beautifully into a highly structured framework in our sources, the 12-hour monuments plan. Because a modern professional isn't just one person. We have highly fragmented internal identities.
This blew my mind. The plan breaks us down into 3 personas. The employee focused on execution. The employer, the strategist looking at deadlines. And the public servant focused on impact and sharing the work.
The friction in our lives comes from the employer making a grand promise, like launching a website by Friday, and the employee screaming, "I don't have the energy for that." If you don't negotiate an internal contract, you get image identity asymmetry, burnout.
So the 12-hour plan divides the day into 4 blocks of 3 hours. See, align, build, declare.
Walk us through a Tuesday using this.
Okay, block 1 is C. The employer surveys the landscape, checks emails, maps, resources, and sets the topic sentence for the day. Block 2 is align. You prep the workspace for the employee.
Block 3 is build. This is the crucible. The employer leaves, the employee takes over for 3 hours of intense, deep labor, no distractions. And block 4 is declare. The public servant steps in, packages the work, and shares it.
And what anchors this is the monument. Like in land surveying, a physical marker. Every 3-hour block has to end with a tangible artifact, a summary, a piece of code. It prevents that horrible feeling of getting to 5 p.m. with nothing to show for it.
But to execute a 12-hour plan, we have to acknowledge biological energy limits.
Yes. The Reddit thread from the Life Pro Tips community, the user said, "Stop treating every second equally. A task that takes 30 minutes at 9 a.m. might take 2 hours at 3 p.m. when your blood sugar crashes."
It's a profound realization. The 12-hour plan puts the heavy build block in the core of the day. It's Stephen Covey's rocks in a bucket. You can't put the big rocks, the deep work in after you've filled the bucket with sand and gravel, the emails and Slack messages.
And another Reddit user, a woman, added such a crucial layer. She tracked her menstrual cycle alongside her task list. First half of her cycle, high energy. Heavy build blocks. End of her cycle, energy plummeted. Once she mapped it, she stopped calling herself lazy and scheduled administrative aligned tasks for low energy weeks.
Treating your internal state as a valid variable is huge. We can't rely on willpower. Which brings us to Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions.
If there's one actionable takeaway today, this is it. Because normal goals are usually useless. I want to finish this report. It doesn't tell your brain when or where to act.
To bridge that gap, Gollwitzer proposes the implementation intention, an if-then plan. If situation X arises, then I will perform response Y. It creates a neurological link between a cue and a behavior.
See, I try this, but mine is like, if I see a dessert menu, I'll order cheesecake, but promise to run 3 miles tomorrow, which doesn't work.
And that's why the then must be an immediate action aligning with your identity. If handed a dessert menu, then I instantly order black coffee. It creates strategic automaticity. You hand control over to the environment so you don't burn willpower debating yourself.
James Clear expands on this with habit stacking. Tie the new habit to an old one. After I pour my coffee, I write 1 paragraph. The coffee is the trigger. Environment is the invisible hand-shaping behavior.
If you want to build a good habit, make the cue obvious. Put gym clothes on your phone. To break a bad habit, make the cue invisible. People with high self-control actually just use it the least. They avoid temptation entirely.
Okay, so we've set the controlling idea, managed energy, used implementation intentions to sit down. Now we have to execute. And the work that matters on day 1 is what Cal Newport calls deep work.
Deep work pushes your cognitive capabilities to their absolute limit. Distraction-free concentration. It creates profound value and is hard to replicate.
The opposite of shallow work emails, Slack, things easily replicated by AI. The tragedy is we are trapped in open-plan offices hostile to deep work. The average knowledge worker checks email 77 times a day.
And every time you check, you pay a switching tax. Newport calls it attention residue. A piece of your focus stays stuck on that email when you try to return to your complex task.
Gloria Mark's research found it takes an average of 23 minutes and 15 seconds to return to deep focus after an interruption. If you're interrupted every 15 minutes, you are literally never in deep concentration.
That's why Darwin had his sand walk to think undisturbed. Stephen King locks himself in a room for 2,000 words a day. Bill Gates takes secret think weeks in a cabin. They aggressively defend their focus.
Because they're trying to enter flow. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's concept of complete absorption. and flow is delicate because of our hard biological limits.
The human mind can only consciously process about 110 bits of information per second. Decoding speech alone takes 40 to 60 bits.
Which is why you can't have a deep conversation with your spouse while reading an email. Your bandwidth is maxed out. To achieve flow, all 110 bits need to be aligned.
And you need 3 conditions. Clear goals are topic sentence, immediate feedback, and the perfect balance of challenge and skill.
James Clear's Goldilocks rule. Not too easy or you get bored, not too hard or you get anxious. Just right. But even then, we can't stay in flow forever. What happens when the battery drains?
We hit ego depletion. There's a study in our stack on action versus state orientation. They physically measured mental fatigue using critical fusion frequency.
The flashing light experiment. Explain how this works.
They showed participants a flashing light. When flashes are far apart, you see pulses. As they speed up, your visual cortex eventually can't process the separation, and the light blurs into a solid beam. That moment is your critical fusion frequency.
Like frame rates in a video game.
Exactly. And the breakthrough was when people are mentally fatigued from willpower-draining tasks, their fusion point happens earlier. The light doesn't have to flash as fast to blur.
That is terrifying.
Yeah, it means the central nervous system's raw processing speed literally slows down. Ego depletion is physical degradation. Willpower is a finite biological resource.
So we have to ruthlessly manage attention. The sources talk about balancing sustained attention, the sniper scope focus, with alternating attention, shifting focus quickly like a line cook. If a knowledge worker alternates all day, they hit ego depletion instantly.
To protect against this, we have to offload the cognitive burden. Digital detoxes. The Kanban method visualizing tasks in columns, but strictly limiting the in-progress column to prevent multitasking.
And David Allen's Getting Things Done, GTD. Your brain is a tool for having ideas, not holding them. You have to dump every open loop into an external system so your brain can return to the deep work of day one.
So we have the internal architecture built, but day one doesn't happen in a vacuum. We live in a messy society.
Yes, surrounded by people and societal expectations. Navigating this messy middle means understanding how our internal identity collides with external pressures. Naomi Elmer's research on social categorization is fascinating here.
She arbitrarily labeled people as either inductive or deductive thinkers, and found that how the group perceives us exerts massive pressure on how we express our identity.
But we don't just blindly accept the label. If it respects our core identity, we internalize it. If it threatens us, we resist, causing internal friction.
And Jamie Lodge's research on work-family image management explores that friction deeply. We are looking at this strictly through the data, impartially. But the paper highlights the immense expectations on working parents from both the corporate and domestic domains.
When a parent feels they are failing these expectations, it creates an image discrepancy. A work deficit feeling like your boss thinks you're uncommitted, or a family deficit feeling like your kids think you're absent.
Humans can't tolerate this discrepancy. The first strategy to fix it is social recategorization. Extreme overcompensation, staying at work until 9 p.m. to signal dedication.
But that creates an asymmetric, exhausted identity if it's not who you truly are. The healthier strategy is positive distinctiveness.
Positive distinctiveness is proudly emphasizing both work and family identities, refusing to play a zero-sum game. It carries short-term risk of social disapproval, but leads to a much more resilient sense of self.
The paper notes vicarious learning is vital here. If leaders model positive distinctiveness, casually mentioning leaving for a school play while delivering great work, it changes the psychological safety for everyone.
The lesson for day one is that building something just for social approval means building on a fault line. Sustainable momentum requires internal alignment.
And what actually fuels that momentum? Amabile and Kramer's research on the power of small wins, they wanted to know what drives a positive inner work life. Our daily mix of emotions and motivation.
They analyzed thousands of diary entries. The biggest driver wasn't a bonus or praise, it was simply making progress in meaningful work.
Incremental progress. Fixing a bug, writing a paragraph, these small wins are psychological fuel. But there's a dark side.
Yes, negativity bias. Small daily setbacks have an outsized, intensely negative effect. A minor roadblock derails motivation much faster than a small win boosts it.
So they recommend a clear contracting approach. An internal contract clarifying goals and anticipating roadblocks, and providing catalysts, resources, and autonomy to manufacture those small wins every day.
So if small wins are the fuel, how do we systematize the engine so actions compound into a product? We are pivoting to a paper titled Bridging the Construction Productivity Gap.
Okay, so value stream mapping makes sense when pouring concrete.
Hmm.
But why are we looking at construction engineering for personal productivity?
Because construction suffers from stagnant productivity due to the one-off factory paradigm. Every building is treated as a bespoke project. A team assembles, struggles through chaos, and dissolves. The next project starts from scratch.
That is exactly how I operate half the time. Every day is a chaotic scramble with no cumulative innovation.
Exactly. Construction engineers argue for context-aware hybridization using value stream mapping, or VSM. They use Shigeo Shingo's two-axis model. The horizontal x-axis is the process, the flow of material. The vertical y-axis represents discrete operations, specific workers doing tasks.
In a car factory, the car moves down the process line. In construction, the building is stationary, so the production flow moves through the product.
Right. And most people try to increase productivity by optimizing only vertical operations. Say you hire an incredibly fast drywall installer, but if the electricians haven't finished wiring the room, the horizontal flow, the drywall guy, just stands around waiting. True productivity is a smooth, balanced, horizontal flow.
So what does this all mean? It maps perfectly onto the Itonic Strategic Alignment Framework's warning about the trap of the quick win. We love checking boxes to feel productive. But if optimizing a vertical operation doesn't advance your horizontal strategic flow, it's a detour.
And to beautifully illustrate how a slow, systematic flow creates a masterpiece, we would look at the Aesthetic Clinic manual in our sources.
This one felt out of left field, but the metaphor is stunning. The Allura Aesthetic Clinic curriculum on microblading and medical tattooing. Microblading isn't just drawing a line. It's an exactingly slow, horizontal process. Golden ratio calipers for symmetry, bone structure analysis, and then laying down hair strokes layer by delicate layer.
And medical tattooing uses microscopic shadows and highlights to recreate missing tissue, which deeply heals psychological discomfort.
Just like the formation of the eye in our intro metaphor, true mastery is never a sudden explosion. It's quiet, layer by layer work, integrating new techniques stroke by stroke.
Okay, so we've built the day architecture, habits, energy blocks, deep work defense, social pressures, and systematizing output. But now we have to look to the future.
Because everything we've discussed relies on our current biological hardware, and we are going to push this eye of thought concept to its absolute technological limit, the frontier of brain-machine interfaces, or BMIs.
We have an extensive report, I, Human, blurring lines between mind and machine, with case studies on Neuralink and precision neuroscience. The ultimate bottleneck right now is our 86 billion neurons trying to communicate through slow physical movements.
There's a quote from Mary Lou Jepsen, CEO of Open Water, who sums this up. She says, "Our brains are way more complex than any computer, but output is constrained by our tongues, jaws, and typing. If we could communicate at the speed of thought, we could vastly augment our intelligence. We are trapped behind slow meat interfaces."
The race is on to bypass that bottleneck. Neuralink is focused on medical applications first, like blind sight implanting devices into the visual cortex to provide bionic vision for the blind.
The FDA gave them breakthrough device designation, and Musk claims this digital signal could eventually exceed biological vision. We might see infrared or ultraviolet light.
But the long-term objective is a digital tertiary layer for the brain, seamless integration with AI.
And his motivation, again, just reporting the source material here, is existential. He believes humanity must achieve symbiosis with AI to mitigate long-term risks as AI becomes exponentially smarter.
While Neuralink uses invasive surgery, precision neuroscience has an ultra-thin, flexible electrode array that rests on the surface of the brain, slipping under the skull without penetrating tissue, drastically lowering medical risk.
But what can we actually do with these? Right now, they use the mental mouse for paralyzed individuals to control a cursor. They use the aha effect. The interface detects the brain's spike when spotting a mistake, allowing spelling just by looking for wrong letters.
We're also seeing brain-to-brain transfers. Researchers trained a rat in the US to press a lever, extracted the neural signal, sent it over the internet, and fed it into a rat in Brazil. The Brazilian rat pressed the identical lever without training.
They've done this with humans too. Senders watched a Tetris game, couldn't touch anything, but transmitted the correct move to a receiver using only their minds by focusing on flashing LED lights.
Decoding is accelerating. UC Berkeley decoded semantic information from a movie people watched, reconstructing video clips from brain activity. UCSF translated neural activity destined for the jaw directly into synthesized speech.
But the text distinguishes this from true mind reading. Decoding motor intent is much simpler than deciphering complex inner thoughts. However, that is the goal. Musk envisions communicating uncompressed concepts directly, or neural postcards, sending the exact sensory experience of walking on a beach to a friend's brain, or mentally remoting into a humanoid robot like Tesla's Optimus.
This I-human future brings profound ethical considerations. Again, we are just observing the debates here. But if we achieve symbiosis with AI, what happens to human autonomy? Are your thoughts truly your own? Where does the machine end and your identity begin?
The report touches on DIY tech too. Transcranial direct current stimulation, TDCS. People buy headsets or build them with batteries and sponges to run electrical currents into their brains, trying to hack neuroplasticity to boost memory.
The military tested TDCS for drone operators, and it can marginally improve endurance by dulling fatigue perception. But medical researchers are concerned about unknown damage, and much of the benefit might just be a placebo response.
There are also corporate concerns like neuromarketing. Companies using EEG systems to monitor brain activity while viewing ads, aiming to bypass conscious thought and target raw emotional responses to optimize sales.
It's a staggering landscape. We've gone from a 19th century philosopher defining thought to a future where thought is digitally beamed into a robotic shell.
The scope is massive, infinite. But I want to bring this massive perspective all the way back down to earth, back to the quiet reality of you, the listener, sitting there right now on day one.
It is essential that we do, because the underlying mechanism connecting all of this biological evolution to the slow construction of a medical tattoo or neural interfaces is exactly the same. The actual mechanism of change happens in the dark. It is quiet. It is invisible.
You don't see your brain physically changing its myelin sheaths during 3 hours of deep work. You don't see BMI paradigm shifts overnight. You see one letter on a screen, one paragraph written, but it's compounding.
If the ultimate future of humanity relies on linking our 86 billion neurons to artificial intelligence to expand our perspective, consider what power you already hold right now. Every time you aggressively protect your attention from a phone ping, every time you use an implementation intention, every time you lay down one clear topic sentence for your day, you are literally physically rewiring the structure of your own brain. The most powerful brain-machine interface currently in existence is your own discipline.
What a profound thought to end on. You hold the power of neuroplasticity in your own hands today. Day one is complete, no magic yet, but something is definitely happening.
This submission explores the biological foundations of the dopamine motivation system, habit formation, and neuroplasticity as a practical guide for creators. Moving directly into our analysis, the first major opportunity for improvement revolves around the exact mechanics of reward anticipation.
Right. The current explanation of the dopamine motivation system oversimplifies dopamine's role as a mere pleasure response, missing its primary function as an anticipatory signal.
The weakness here is that the material frames the reward phase of the habit loop simply as the satisfaction received after an action is completed.
Which ignores neurobiological evidence showing that dopamine actually spikes prior to the reward. It acts as a prediction error signal rather than a hedonic pleasure center.
The suggestion for improvement is to realign the core formula to reflect that dopamine fuels the craving and anticipation of the reward,
establishing it as the biological driver of seeking behavior and incentive salience. We need a layered understanding of this process.
Exactly. For concrete examples of improvement, the author could detail how a specific cue activates the ventral tegmental area to release a phasic burst of dopamine into the nucleus accumbens.
We can look at that functionally. The ventral tegmental area is essentially the origin point, the spark.
Right. When a creator experiences a familiar cue, like sitting at their desk with their coffee, that area doesn't wait for the work to be done. It fires instantly,
sending dopamine to the nucleus accumbens, which acts as the gas pedal. It creates a calm biological drive to seek.
It is a soft, repetitive mechanism that evolved long before modern creative work existed.
By explaining this, the author shows that motivation isn't a mystical force. It's a physical, anticipatory spark that happens before any results are achieved.
Another concrete example the author should include is contrasting predictable outcomes with variable ratio reinforcement schedules.
This is crucial because it beautifully illustrates how unpredictable progress actually maximizes the anticipation phase.
Let's observe the implications of that for a creator's workflow. The current draft assumes a static sequence. You write the chapter, you feel good.
But predictability dampens the dopamine response over time.
When a reward is certain, baseline dopamine firing remains flat.
But when the outcome is unpredictable, when there is a slight variation in the reward, the anticipation phase is prolonged and intensified.
The text can point to how social media platforms utilize a variable ratio reinforcement schedule to keep the brain in a continuous state of seeking.
A repetitive seeking loop. The author can teach creators to artificially introduce variability into their own work to hack this system.
No hype, no moralizing, just awareness of how the system operates.
As a final concrete example for this section, the author could describe the wanting versus liking paradigm to accurately define how the mesolimbic pathway operates before the creator's action is even finished.
In behavioral neuroscience, dopamine is responsible for the wanting or the motivational salience. It gets you to start.
The actual liking, that feeling of satisfaction when the work is done, is driven by entirely different neurochemicals.
By separating these two concepts, the text removes a massive psychological burden from the reader.
If a creator finishes an exhausting editing session and doesn't feel a huge wave of pleasure, they haven't failed. The dopamine already did its job by getting them to execute the task.
A calm, scientific observation. The creator's formula becomes incredibly actionable when we remove the expectation that dopamine equals happiness.
Moving to the next pillar, the assertion that repetition rewires the brain lacks the specific anatomical mechanism necessary to explain how habits become physically faster and more automatic over time.
The weakness here is that stating broadly that the brain adapts through neuroplasticity overlooks the critical role of white matter plasticity, specifically myelination,
which is the structural change that optimizes neural signal conduction, as well as the transition of behavioral control between distinct brain regions.
Hello, a creator that their brain simply adapts sounds like a vague, abstract mental shift. It doesn't capture the physical reality of what is happening inside their head.
The suggestion for improvement is to expand the neuroplasticity pillar to include the physical insulation of active neural circuits and the transfer of cognitive processing from goal-directed systems to habitual systems.
For concrete examples of improvement, the text could first describe how deliberate, repetitive practice stimulates the brain to thicken myelin sheaths around active axons.
The author can explain myelin using a very accessible analogy. It functions just like the rubber insulation wrapped around a copper electrical wire.
When a creator repeats a specific action, like drafting a newsletter, they are firing a very specific sequence of neurons.
And the more they fire that sequence, the more the brain responds by wrapping those connections in myelin, this fatty insulating layer.
It increases the electrical resistance of the axonal membrane and decreases capacitance,
meaning the electrical signal doesn't leak out. It travels significantly faster and more efficiently.
A slight variation in the thickness of this myelin sheath leads to exponential increases in the speed of the neural signal.
It is a process of physical thickening, soft, repetitive layers being laid down over time.
This completely demystifies the idea that practice makes perfect. It is a physical paving of a neural highway.
Another concrete example the author should use is explaining the cognitive offloading process, where control of the habit shifts from the resource-heavy prefrontal cortex to the dorsolateral striatum.
Let's observe that dynamic because it fundamentally changes how a creator views their energy levels.
In the early stages of learning a new software or writing format, the prefrontal cortex is heavily engaged. It is the executive controller, and it demands immense metabolic energy. It is slow and deliberate.
But as that myelin thickens and the circuit becomes optimized, the brain performs this elegant act of cognitive offloading.
The behavior physically moves away from the prefrontal cortex down into the basal ganglia.
Specifically the dorsolateral striatum, which is the domain of the habitual controller. It conserves energy by automating the familiar.
And as a final concrete example for this section, the author could detail how dopamine facilitates the direct pathway in the basal ganglia to chunk individual actions into seamless macro actions.
Chunking is a foundational concept. Once the dorsolateral striatum takes over, the individual, discrete steps of opening a document, setting the formatting, and typing the first heading are no longer processed as separate, computationally heavy decisions.
The basal ganglia groups them together. The dopamine system greases the wheels, smoothing the transition from one step to the next.
Calm, neutral efficiency. The The brain is simply doing what it evolved to do, save energy.
But for this deep automation to occur, the brain requires an environment that allows it to focus. This brings us to the third core pillar discussed in the submission. The framework for deep focus neglects the biological obstacles the brain must continuously overcome to suppress distractors and sustain goal-directed attention.
The weakness here is that the simple transition from cue to start work assumes an isolated environment, failing to account for the cognitive depletion of the prefrontal cortex caused by modern digital stimuli, continuous task switching, and variable reinforcement loops.
The material highlights flow as the end result, but it ignores the biological friction happening in the background.
A modern creator is surrounded by highly engineered stimuli. Every notification, every open tab, every buzz of a phone is an external cue aggressively competing for the brain's attention.
That is the reality of the landscape. The suggestion for improvement is to integrate the concepts of distractor suppression, cognitive load, and neural recovery to provide a scientifically grounded, layered understanding of how to initiate and protect the habit loop.
For concrete examples of improvement, the author could first explain how constant digital notifications physically fatigue the executive functions of the prefrontal cortex,
Leading to a bias toward immediate, concrete rewards. We just observed how resource-heavy the prefrontal cortex is.
The brain has a filtering mechanism, and the prefrontal cortex has to actively exert top-down control to suppress irrelevant activations.
Every single time a distractor appears on a screen, the prefrontal cortex must generate an inhibitory signal to stop the brain's salience network from hijacking the creator's attention.
This is a constant, invisible battle. It is a repetitive expenditure of metabolic energy.
And that energy is highly finite. When the creator is sitting at their desk trying to focus and their phone lights up 10 times in an hour, they suffer from attentional depletion. Their executive functions become fatigued.
When that fatigue sets in, we observe a distinct shift in decision-making. The brain's capacity for intertemporal choice, which is the ability to delay gratification for a larger future reward, becomes heavily compromised.
The fatigued brain defaults to the path of least resistance, which in our modern environment is usually a variable ratio reinforcement loop on a social media feed.
Including this fundamentally changes the reader's perspective. When a creator stops working to scroll on their phone, it is not a flaw in their character.
It is not a lack of willpower. It is a predictable biological outcome because their prefrontal cortex simply lacks the metabolic capacity to continue suppressing distractors.
No judgment, just observation. That layered understanding naturally leads to the next concrete example the author should include, which is proposing the implementation of environmental friction to block distractions entirely.
If we observe that willpower is biologically finite, then relying on the prefrontal cortex to ignore a phone sitting on the desk is a structurally unsound strategy.
The text should provide actionable steps for altering the physical workspace to eliminate the cues before they even register, putting the phone in another room, using software to block specific websites during the work phase,
modifying the environment to protect the prefrontal cortex. It requires absolute zero metabolic energy to ignore a distraction that simply isn't there.
And the final concrete example the author could suggest is implementing a digital detox to serve as a restorative niche.
Allowing the default mode network to recover, preserving the prefrontal cortex's capacity for intertemporal choice and deep focus in the long run.
Biological systems require homeostasis. They require cycles of exertion and recovery.
The current draft implies a linear progression of effort, but that is not how the biological system operates.
When a creator steps away from their deep focus work, but immediately looks at their phone to watch a video or read the news, they are merely switching from one directed attention task to another.
The prefrontal cortex is still actively engaged in processing external stimuli. The brain isn't resting at all.
This is where the default mode network comes into play. It is a large-scale brain network that only becomes highly active during states of wakeful rest, things like daydreaming, mind-wandering, or taking a walk without headphones.
It is the biological opposite of the task-positive network used during deep focus. It is the brain's restorative niche.
If a creator never allows the default mode network to activate, the cognitive fatigue just carries over to the next day. The prefrontal cortex begins the next work session already depleted.
By engaging in activities that require only soft fascination, like sitting quietly or walking in nature, the creator provides the brain with true recovery.
The default mode network activates. The prefrontal cortex recovers its metabolic capacity, and the entire system resets. A calm, biological cycle. Exertion and recovery.
Distractor suppression and default mode network activation. By integrating these scientific realities, the author takes a very simple formula and transforms it into a deeply robust methodology.
The creator learns to leverage the dopamine prediction error to spark the work. They protect their prefrontal cortex using environmental friction. They rely on consistent repetition to drive myelination. And they engage in true disconnection to allow the default mode network to restore their bandwidth.
It removes the moral weight of failure from the creator's shoulders. By aligning their workflow with the physical reality of white matter plasticity and dopamine kinetics, they can build habits that are physically wired to succeed.
To summarize this critique, the most significant opportunities to refine this material involve deepening the biological accuracy of its core pillars without losing its practical appeal.
The actionable steps for the author are to update the definition of the dopamine reward phase to focus on anticipation and prediction error. Include white matter plasticity and myelination as the physical mechanisms of automaticity, and address the absolute necessity of distractor suppression to protect the prefrontal cortex during deep focus.
We invite the listener to apply these structural and scientific refinements and to submit the updated material back to us for further observation and analysis.